All right, our first speaker is Dr. Sarah Hirsh. She is the ag agent in Somerset County. She's going to be talking about nitrogen management in humid temperate climates.
Hey everyone, thanks for tuning in today. Like Megan said, we're going to be talking about nitrogen management in this region of the country. And so we're kind of in a unique place here, unlike some other parts of the country where they may have a dry season and a rainy season. Here we're going to have year-round rain and quite a bit of rain compared to other parts of the country. And that is really going to impact what happens with our nitrogen. So of course, nitrogen is the #1 nutrient that crops need in order to grow, whether they get that from fertilizer, from organic sources of fertilizer, or our synthetic fertilizers, or whether they're legumes like a soybean, it's going to be pulling that from the atmosphere. But regardless of the crop, they need nitrogen more than any other nutrient. And we're going to be talking about how we can do the best job that we can to keep that nitrogen in the crop field and available for our crops. So this is the nitrogen cycle, and I know it's quite overwhelming looking at it, and I'm not expecting that anybody's going to remember all of this. Kind of the point I wanted to make by putting this up here is how complicated it is, because there are a lot of different pathways that the nitrogen can go, and a lot of different forms of nitrogen. And that's why it's so problematic, because a lot of these forms will some of these forms are gas forms, like the ammonia gas or the N2 gas. Some of these forms are readily dissolved in water, like nitrate. So anytime you have something that's liquid or gas, then that's going to be easily lost from the system. So that's why the nitrogen cycle is important to kind of look at a little bit. Each of the boxes here are a form of nitrogen. So we can have nitrogen in organic forms. We can have nitrogen as ammonium, which is 1 nitrogen attached to 4 hydrogen particles. We can have nitrogen in this nitrite or nitrate form. So that's nitrogen attached to oxygen particles, and this form is going to be readily dissolved in water and can be lost through leaching. We can have nitrogen as ammonia gas, and that can also be that can evaporate because it's a gas, or N2. There's 4 different nitrogen gases. We have nitrogen N2, we have nitrous oxide and nitric oxide. So a lot of different forms of the nitrogen. All of these exclamation points here are things we need to be concerned with thinking from a crop field or agricultural perspective, because these are ways that the nitrogen could be lost from our crop field. So leaching, erosion, volatilization, those are all ways it can be lost. What we want is right here in the middle, of course, is the plant uptake. So ideally, we want all of the nitrogen that's cycling through our soil and in our crop system. We want all of that to be taken up by the plant in an ideal world. This is never going to happen, but we can try to get as close to that as we can. And I will come back to this diagram repeatedly throughout the presentation, and we're going to talk about each one of these loss pathways and some of the management steps that we can do to try to avoid the loss. So there's something called the 4R principles of nutrient stewardship, and that these refer to the right source, the right rate, the right time, and the right place. You may have heard of these before. So this is just the idea that we're going to minimize our losses and maximize our efficiency and therefore our profitability by following these rules of thumb: the right source, the right rate. So you can think about this in terms of nitrogen, putting that out at the right time and putting it in the right place. So that the right place could be like putting it right near the plant roots so it more easily can take it up. So the first thing I'm going to talk about has to do with the right time, and that's side dressing nitrogen on corn. So again, leaching of nitrate out of the root zone and denitrification are processes that cannot be directly controlled. However, we can reduce their occurrence by waiting to apply nitrogen until the crop is ready to take it up. And by doing that, we're going to reduce the time that the nitrogen sits in the soil, and we're going to therefore reduce the time that that nitrogen could be lost before it's taken up by the plant. So the conditions for denitrification and leaching are greatest in the spring. However, this is really key. Corn uptake of nitrogen is minimal till approximately 35 days after emergence. So you have these prime conditions to lose nitrogen, and you have very little nitrogen being needed by that young corn plant. So if you've grown corn, I'm sure you know it kind of is little for a while, and then it just takes off, and you might overnight, it's like you can see that corn plant growing. And so whenever you see a rapid growth like that, that is correlated with a rapid nitrogen uptake, and we want the corn to have the nitrogen at that point. So they recommend that 50 to 90% of the required nitrogen be applied at side dress time when the corn is 10 to 20 inches tall. So here's a graph showing what I was just talking about. So let's say we plant our corn at the beginning of May, and then this is the corn nitrogen uptake. So very slow for about that first month, and then it just takes off, and we have that huge amount of nitrogen uptake occurring between June and July. By July, August, and then all the way until we harvest that crop, very little nitrogen is being taken up. As you can see, the corn is kind of drying down. At that point, it's not taking up nitrogen anymore. So it really doesn't need nitrogen in the soil there. And another way of looking at it is that any nitrogen that is applied pre-plant, all of that nitrogen is going to be in that vulnerable category. So that nitrogen is going to be vulnerable to be lost if it's all applied at pre-plant timing. However, if we look at this other scenario where in this scenario, we're applying the nitrogen at nitrogen side dress time, we really have a much smaller pool of nitrogen in that first month that's vulnerable to be lost, and we have less nitrogen that's vulnerable to be lost when the corn is rapidly taking it up. And so that overall pool of vulnerable nitrogen has really shrunk when we are applying at side dress time. This is another way of looking at the seasonal nitrogen uptake of the corn plant that's kind of interesting. And so at the beginning of the season, here you can imagine their same date. So if it was planted May 1st, at the beginning of the season, the nitrogen is going into the leaf blades and a little bit into the stalk. And then by the end of the season, the nitrogen is going into the grain. However, that's not new nitrogen that's being taken up by the soil. That's nitrogen that is just shifting around within the plant. So it's going to be taking that nitrogen from the leafy and the stalk areas of the plant and putting all that nitrogen into the grain and filling that grain. All right, and so another way, so one way we can reduce our nitrogen that is lost is just by applying it at the right time or side dressing it. Another form of nitrogen that we need to be aware of that could potentially be lost is urea, and that could be urea fertilizer or UAN, which is urea ammonium nitrate fertilizer. And both of those contain ammonia, which can volatilize and be lost. And so it's important for that type of fertilizer that we're incorporating it into the soil, or we have a rain after application, and that's going to prevent that loss of the ammonia through volatilization. And that applies for poultry litter as well, which contains a lot of urea. So these graphs are showing the percent of urea fertilizer surface applied to soils that volatilizes as ammonia over time in response to the soil temperatures and pH. And so we do have, as we get higher soil pH, we are going to have more of the urea volatilize as that ammonia. And also, as we have warmer temperatures, we're going to have more of the urea volatilize. So those are just some environmental factors to keep in mind. So there's a bunch of rules of thumb that we can follow to try to minimize ammonia nitrogen volatilization. So first of all, it's best if we don't broadcast urea on the soil surface. Instead, we can incorporate it by dribbling it instead of spraying it. So anytime you have more of a concentration and less of kind of a fine broadcasted spray, we're going to have less loss. So you want it to be kind of concentrated. If you are just applying it to the surface, try to band it. Number 3 and number 4 is that we can minimize ammonia volatilization by mixing it with sulfate in gypsum or in ammonium sulfate. And we can also use slow release urea formulations. So this was some research looking at the amount of ammonia emission. You can see here over the summer and these different application methods. So here, when it included a double inhibitor, there's really no loss compared to, here's just surface area applied where you can see that there's quite a bit more loss. Injected was much less was lost than when it was surface applied. Again, some similar research coming out of a different group. So this was the accumulative ammonia loss again, and the number of days after they side dress applied it. And these were the different ways that they applied it. So here, if we look at the rate of 40 pounds, you can see that when it was polycoated, there was less loss due to ammonia. And also, if we look at the 80-pound rate, we can see that polycoated had less, and even less was when it was included the urease inhibitor. So other ways to minimize ammonia volatilization, we want to water in the urea after broadcasting. And so if you get a good rain, that's good. If you have irrigation equipment, you could run the pivot around once and just try to get that urea into the soil. And that's going to allow for less opportunity for that ammonia to volatilize away. And also, it's recommended that we incorporate manure within 12 hours of spreading. Again, we're going to lose less nitrogen. Any nitrogen lost is, of course, going to be lost profits. This graph is showing how other ways to minimize ammonia and nitrogen volatilization, and that's by injecting those ammonia fertilizers. So here we have again the ammonia loss rate and the days after application, and you can see quite a bit is being lost that in this purple line here that was surface broadcast. When it was incorporated, we have less lost. And when it was no-till injected, that resulted in the best scenario, and we had the least amount of loss. Also, dung beetles can help to incorporate those ammonia sources and prevent loss. So just keeping that agroecosystem healthy and encouraging these beneficial insect populations. This is an example of a knifing implement that knives in liquid fertilizer. And then here we can just see the differences kind of in a cartoon form of the different methods of nutrient placement. And you can imagine which ones of these methods are going to result in the least amount of ammonia loss. So anytime we're getting the ammonia down into the soil, it's going to be binding with the soil through kind of cation exchange, which is basically just like magnetic attraction. And so it's not going to be lost. So here we have incorporated through tillage, banding, injection, of course, is going to be stable down in the soil. And even the dribbling on or banding that fertilizer is going to result in less loss than when it's just broadcast all over the surface. So nitrogen primarily moves from the land in dissolved drainage water. And so we have some nitrogen carried away on the surface by runoff and erosion, but primarily what we're concerned about is the nitrogen moving down through the soil. It's very mobile, it dissolves readily in water, and it's going to move down through the soil very rapidly. And that's where our region is particularly, because where we live, it's a particular concern because we have that year-round rain and relatively warm weather, and the microbes are very active, that a lot of that nitrogen is going to be at risk to move down. This is contrary to phosphorus, which is carried mainly through surface runoff and erosion. So again, with nitrogen, we're focused on reducing that leaching or moving down through the soil profile. Whereas the phosphorus, you may be concerned more with reducing the runoff and erosion. So going back to talking about our different forms of nitrogen. And so what we've been talking about is ammonia volatilization, which is related to the ammonium. Ammonium actually gets converted through a microbial process to become nitrate. Now, plants can take up nitrogen in the ammonium form or in the nitrate form, but because we have these microbes in the soil, and this is a part of decomposition, so any nitrogen in the soil that's in the ammonium form is likely going to be quickly transformed into that nitrate form. And up to 55 pounds of nitrogen per acre per day can be transformed by the microbes from the ammonium form into the nitrate form. And so basically these microbes are called nitrosomas and nitrobacter, and they're taking that form and breathing in oxygen, and they're converting it over to this other form. Now, why do we care about this? Because ammonium, you can see here, it has that positive charge on it. That I mentioned before, that magnetic attraction. So that form is going to be pretty stable in the soil. That's going to be magnetically attracted to the soil particles through cation exchange, and it's not going to be very mobile. However, that is being transformed by the microbes to the nitrate form. And the nitrate form is where we need to beware, because this one is very soluble and very mobile in the soil because it has the negative charge. Therefore, it's not going to be attracted through cation exchange onto the soil, and it's going to leach down through the soil and be lost. So here we are back at this diagram, and this is what I'm talking about right here, this danger zone where we have the ammonia that has been converted to this nitrate form. And here we have this big potential loss pathway that we have to be very concerned with. And this can happen quickly. So nitrogen in this form can move down 3 feet through the soil profile in a matter of months in our region. And we're going to get into the details of some of that in a bit. So one way to address this problem is to try to keep nitrogen in the ammonium form, because that is plant available and it's not as and it's not going to be lost from the system like the nitrate. And so we could try to limit the amount of ammonium that's being converted to nitrate. And what we could do to that is there's some different commercial compounds that some people try to use. Maybe some of you have heard of these things that can try to slow down this process of conversion. And so things called N-Serve, Dwell, some of these different compounds, they try to stop this chemical microbial reaction and to keep nitrogen in the ammonium form. They may delay the conversion of ammonium by 2 to 6 weeks. And this can be very useful in very wet years, in very sandy soils, or in poorly drained soils. However, it's not always effective across the board. So I've heard pretty kind of mixed reviews depending on who you talk to again, and it may be helpful and economically wise one year, especially if you get a lot of rain, but then not really helpful in other environmental cases. So again, pretty inconsistent profitability for those. So the next form of nitrogen that I'm going to be talking about is when this nitrate, so remember the nitrate is the one that can be dissolved and leached into the groundwater. So when the nitrate becomes N2 gas through denitrification. So this is an anaerobic process, or it does not which means it does not require oxygen. You have to have a lack of oxygen for this to occur. And that's really key. And we're going to be talking about that because, again, in our region, like you saw on my opening slide, that picture of the flooded cornfield. So that is the case right there, that you would have the potential for denitrification because that field is underwater, even if it's only for a few hours or a day or two. Anytime that field is underwater and there's no oxygen, there's going to be microbes that are converting nitrate into N2 gas through denitrification. So you also need decomposable organic matter, which we have, of course, in a crop field. We have organic matter and crop residues lying around, and it is more likely to occur in warm temperatures like our summers. So perfect environment for denitrification to be occurring. And if we go back to our little diagram here, what we're talking about here is we have our nitrate, and we're talking about the potential for it to be lost right here through denitrification into N2 gas. So again, any of that nitrate that's being lost as N2 gas is not going to be available for plant uptake. And here's an example. You see that classic yellowing signs of nitrogen deficiency in corn. And you can see this is the low-lying area of the field kind of flooded underwater. And likely a lot of the reason for that low amount of, for that nitrogen deficiency there is because that nitrogen has been lost as a gas. Here we can see another photo, this low-lying area of the field. I have no idea who that guy is, but the low-lying area of the field is showing those signs of nitrogen deficiency. And this is kind of interesting and a related fact that riparian zones, part of the reason why they're important, they are preventing some erosion and catching soil as it runs off. But also, if we have these riparian zones kind of like in these flooded areas right near the creek, that's going to be enabling those anaerobic conditions or the conditions that lack oxygen and allow for that denitrification to be occurring. So we're going to be losing nitrogen that's dissolved in this water here in the nitrate form. That can be converted to N2 gas, which is not a dangerous gas, and that will prevent that nitrate from entering the bodies of water. So that's, and this is just showing that we get more and more denitrification occurring, which is a good thing in this case, as we get closer to the creek in that riparian zone. So we do have, so a lot of the nitrogen cycle is dependent on the percent of the soil pore water volume filled with water. And so again, as we get to those anaerobic conditions, or where there's very little air in the pores and almost 100% filled with pore water, we start getting a lot more denitrification. So in our region, nitrate will commonly leach about a foot between the fall and the spring. That's really of concern. I mean, we don't want to lose all of our nitrogen from the system over the winter. And that's part of the reason that in Maryland, we have mandated nutrient management plans. We have a cover crop program. We have a lot of efforts in place to try to reduce that amount of nitrogen that is leaching down through the soil. However, even when crops are fertilized at the recommended rates, we still have a fair amount, a substantial amount of mineral nitrogen that remains in the soil at the end of the growing season. And I'm going to first talk about some background literature, and then we also did some studies right here in Maryland that are showing this. So a study in Pennsylvania found between 66 and 84 pounds of nitrogen remaining in the upper 6 feet of soil, or 4 feet of soil. And that was for non-manured and manured soils respectively. So it's kind of across the board with all different forms of nitrogen having been applied. And another interesting fact is that cover crops do take up a lot of nitrogen from the soil, especially when they're planted early. And that is an indication that there is nitrogen to be taken up in the soil. And so if there's a lot of nitrogen that cover crops are able to scavenge, that's nitrogen that is not going to be lost due to leaching. So we did look at 29 farm fields in Maryland and up into southern Pennsylvania a little bit, where we're basically just looking at how much nitrogen is left following growing a cash crop of corn or soybean. So we basically just took a very deep soil core. We went down to 7 feet deep. We got the soil out here. You can see it spread out. And then we analyzed it in the lab for the amount of nitrogen that was in that soil. And across those 29 farm fields, there is an average of 100 pounds per acre of nitrate, and then another 120 pounds of ammonia. Again, we're primarily concerned with that 100 pounds of nitrate, because that's the form that's going to be readily lost. And that was from 0 to 7 feet deep. About half of that was in the top 3 feet in the soil, and the other half was in that deeper subsoil layer. And that wasn't only after corn, it was also after a non-fertilized soybean crop. So we are finding those pools of nitrogen across the board. It wasn't only in drought years where maybe we accidentally over-fertilized the crops because we weren't expecting a drought. This was across the board where we're finding substantial residual nitrogen left over in the soil. Of course, nitrogen not used by crops is money lost for the farmers, and it can also lead to these environmental problems. And again, this isn't, the amount of nitrogen that's left in the soil is not a result of over-fertilizing. We're pretty strict in Maryland about the amount of fertilizer that we are allowed to apply. And so these are other factors having to do with our climate and our soils, and I will get into that in a bit here. So we have to look at, we do have these substantial pools of nitrogen left over. And we can start to look at how can we use these pools of nitrogen for our benefit. And so, of course, nobody wants them to be leached out into bodies of water, anything like that. But we also want them to be used for our benefit, for our farm profitability, and to be used to grow the following year's crop. So how can we get kind of more bang for our buck out of the nitrogen that we are applying? This is just a kind of pictorial representation of what's happening. Here's our leftover nitrogen after growing corn or soybean. It's at risk to leach over the winter into the groundwater because here we are planting corn the following May. So what I kind of want to get into now is I mentioned that this large pool of leftover nitrogen is not necessarily due to people over fertilizing. And that's when we get back into what's happening with the nitrogen cycle. So remember, only a part of the nitrogen that our crops are taking up is coming from the fertilizer. A lot of the nitrogen that our crops are taking up is coming from our soil and our organic matter. And so if we remember back to the nitrogen cycle, it starts off as all of those residues left on the soil surface, those are going to be decomposed. That's organic matter. And organic matter has a lot of nitrogen in it. And so those are organic forms of nitrogen that are going to be decomposed and broken down into our chemical forms of nitrogen. And so organic matter is going to be broken down into ammonium, which will be converted into nitrate, which can be leached. And so a lot of this is just happening naturally through our organic matter breaking down in the soil, and especially in the mid-Atlantic region. So it's not like we get a very cold winter where we don't have any microbial activity happening. We tend to have pretty temperate winters where the microbes are still able to be working. We still have rain in this region and the microbes need that water. And so we have a pretty hospitable environment for those microbes to be doing what they do, which is decomposing that organic matter. Another way to view it is that the sun still shines, the rain still falls, and the microbes are working 12 months a year, but the crops are, and so they're putting out that nitrate 12 months a year, but the crops are only taking it up during their summer months. So we have a lot of nitrate being put out throughout the rest of the year. The rain is really important, the fact that we have year-round rain around here, because the more rain that we get, we're going to have more denitrification losses because we'll have more of those conditions without oxygen. We'll have more nitrogen potentially eroded. You can think about water washing off the soil. And we definitely have more water that can be moved down, and the water can be moved down quicker through leaching the more rain that we have. So I mentioned before that plants will take up both the ammonium forms and the nitrate forms. It's kind of interesting, actually, when plants take up nitrate, they convert it back within the plant tissue to ammonium to use that. The reason that they have adopted to take up nitrate is because that is the most abundant form of nitrogen in the soil. So cultivated soils typically contain 0.15% nitrogen, and 98% of that occurs as part of organic molecules. So there's only this 2% tiny fraction of nitrogen that is in those inorganic forms. This 2% are the forms that plants can take up. And so this right here is our nitrate and our ammonium forms of nitrogen, but this blue 98% is really important because this gets back to the idea that all of this organic nitrogen can be decomposed and converted into these inorganic forms at any time throughout the year. So we always have kind of this big pool of nitrogen waiting to be converted in the background. So even if you're not fertilizing, even if you're not adding fertilizer of these inorganic forms into the system, all throughout the year, microbes are going to be adding inorganic forms of nitrogen into our system. And basically this is just showing from the Soils 101 textbook exactly what I was just talking about. So we have in basic soil science 101, students are learning that we have these organic forms of nitrogen, and the microbes are constantly going to be converting these into the inorganic or mineral forms of nitrogen. We have a lot of inputs of nitrogen to the soil every year. So every time we grow a crop, we're having the residues be added into that system, and we're adding more organic matter into that system. And those are going to be decomposing and releasing nitrogen in those inorganic or mineral forms. Here you can see that happening. Of course, the leaf didn't look like this when it was on the tree. You can see that it's lost all of that organic matter, all that biomass in that leaf has been decomposed and is now in the soil as inorganic forms. And this is a really interesting graph. And I think a lot of times we kind of don't imagine this when we're thinking about where our crops get their nitrogen from. But so this is the amount of nitrogen uptake in a crop and the days after planting. And so look at this blue line here. Only a fraction of the nitrogen being taken up by our crop is coming from fertilizer. The majority of the nitrogen is coming from those background levels of nitrogen in our soil. So regardless of how well we do with applying our fertilizer at the right time in the right place and all of those factors, we still need to really be aware of what is happening to that nitrogen that's occurring naturally and being decomposed and being added into our soil. And so one way where we can kind of recapture some of that pool of nitrogen is through cover crops. So cover crops, especially when they're planted early, are excellent at growing deep roots quickly and scavenging that leftover nitrogen and recycling it to the soil surface where it can be incorporated into a following cash crop. And this is kind of a win-win situation. And so any nitrogen that we're not capturing of that leftover pool is really an economic loss to the farmers. It also can contribute to pollution and environmental concerns in the Chesapeake Bay. So basically, the idea with cover crops, and especially deep-rooted cover crops, is that they can capture and recycle some of that nitrogen. Here's a picture of a radish, crimson clover, triticale cover crop, and you can see there's deep roots growing there that potentially will be scavenging that leftover nitrogen. And we did some research across Maryland and Pennsylvania, and we found that indeed they are actually doing what we expected and scavenging that nitrogen. So this is the amount. I'm going to move on, let's see, to the next graph. Here we go. So this is the amount of soil nitrate across 6 farms in the fall and in the spring. And so we took deep soil cores down to 7 feet deep, which is here on the y-axis, and the x-axis is the amount of nitrate in that soil. And the black line here, first you can take a look at that line. So that's the amount of nitrogen down through the soil profile when there was no cover crop grown. And all of these colored lines here, the blue line is a mixed cover crop, the green line is a winter cereal of wheat or rye or triticale, and the orange line was a monoculture of the forage radish. But you can see, regardless of the cover crop that was grown, they all helped to reduce the amount of nitrate in the soil profile in the fall. If we jump down to this lower graph, same idea here, but this is samples taken in the spring. So again, soil surface down to 7 feet deep, the amount of nitrate in the spring, and we can see down to 7 feet deep, all of those cover crop systems had less nitrate all the way down to 7 feet deep as compared to the no cover crop control black line here. So all of these are going to be really promising at preventing that nitrate from being lost. And then you can see here, especially with the mixed species and the radish, those are releasing the nitrogen on the soil surface in the spring. And so this nitrogen can then be taken up by, if we have a corn crop growing next, they can then be taken up by that corn crop and used, increasing our efficiency of that cropping system. Planting date is really critical if we are looking to scavenge and recycle any leftover nitrogen. And so there's a huge difference in the growth and the roots that you get with an October 1st planting. That's actually a radish right there in my hand, versus about a September 1st planting. So planting a month earlier is going to lead to a huge difference in the amount of nitrate that can be taken up. Here showing the same thing, early September planted radish and rye compared to early October planted radish and rye. And the data backs that up. We can see it in the photos that we're going to get a lot more scavenging if we have an early planted cover crop, but we actually have data that backs that up. And so from 2 feet deep, early planted cover crops took up 10 times more nitrogen than late planted cover crops. And from 4 feet deep, early planted cover crops took up 38 times more nitrogen than late planted cover crops. So early planting can be really key if we want those cover crops to scavenge that nitrogen. If you can kind of imagine, it's the cover crop is up here, and here's our nitrate that's left over in the soil profile. It's a moving target. So that nitrate is going to move downward 3 feet over the winter. So we want to try to catch that with our cover crop roots in the fall before it has had a chance to move down 3 feet over the winter. By the spring, it's going to be out of reach for those cover crops, even if we get a lot of spring growth. There's been some studies with the amount of nitrate in leaching water that show similar results. And so when cover crops were planted, all these green lines down here, we had much lower levels of nitrate in the leaching water at 3 to 4 feet deep than when there was no cover crop. So this was the amount of nitrate in the leaching water in February through April, much lower across the board for cover crops than no cover crop. But again, the planting date was important. So you can see here, these cover crops are pretty good looking cover crops. Probably planted by mid-September. Here we can see that the cover crops that were planted earlier had much lower nitrate levels in the pore water than the cover crops that were planted later. And these were pore water samples from February. We're seeing, as expected, scavenging and recycling that nitrogen to the following corn. We are seeing that corn yields can improve following cover crops that do release that nitrogen on the soil surface. So this was a study done in Howard County, Maryland, and compared to the winter cereal cover crop, which tends to tie up that nitrogen, the cover crops that do release the nitrogen such as the mixed species or the radish, they are going to result in higher grain yield, corn grain yield. I think the pictures here really are telling as well. This was the photos taken the same day, same field, side-by-side plots. We can see after no cover crop, after the rye cover crop, and after the radish cover crop. So if you are planting a rye cover crop and following that with corn, the rye is going to be effective at scavenging that nitrogen, but you probably will need to add a little bit, definitely more fertilizer than after a radish or mixed cover crop if you want that nitrogen to be available for the following corn. So in conclusion here, coming back to our 4 principles, the right type of fertilizer, the right rate at the right time, and the right placement. And then I'll just add to that, especially important for our Mid-Atlantic region, is that we want something growing as long as possible. Just try to remember that image of the sun, of the kind of the year and the sun shining, and we have rain year round. The microbes are really active year round, but we only have crops growing in that short part of that year. And so anything we can do on the off season to keep living roots growing and to keep that nitrogen secure in our crop fields is going to be beneficial for our efficiency. It's going to save money in fertilizer costs, and it's going to prevent any losses, or it's going to minimize the losses out into the environment and in the bay. And with that, this is my contact information. I think we have some time for questions now, but feel free to email me or call my office. And if you're so inclined, I really appreciate anybody who would want to rate my teaching. We work for University of Maryland Extension, and that's part of what's required, that we get teaching evaluations. So I'll turn it back over to Megan if she wants to moderate the questions.
All right, thanks, Sarah. We don't have anything in the chat box right now, but again, if you have any questions, you can put them in the chat box, and or you can, we have a small group, so you can unmute yourself and ask. Either one is an option.
Yep. And I know I went through a lot of that quick, so I'm happy to go back to any of the slides you want to talk about more.
Can you hear me?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, this is Mike Milkey. Have you done any studies on or considered any for the effect that the goose population has on the cereal cover crops? Because the cover crops do a wonderful job, but you know, when the geese eat them and then go back out in the river and poop, you know, I just wonder, you know, if some is lost there, because you know, Dr. Russ Brinsfield, you know, it was one of the best silver bullets, you know, we ever had, you know, and it does work, but I just think that can possibly throw a little monkey wrench in on it, you know. And then I see in our area we have a lot of people, you know, like hunting, and they love the cereal cover crops, especially wheat, but they don't like the radishes. I guess the geese don't like it. So I guess that's a situation that ties our hands a little bit. I think some of the farms I have, people wouldn't want radishes in particular.
Mm-hmm. And do you think they would, even if they still had the wheat or the rye, but they incorporated some other species in a mix, do you think they still would be opposed to that for hunting?
That could be a possibility to mix some of the in there, but they do like the and to be honest, the we've even got some feedback. Some of the hunters realize that the geese like the young and tender wheat even more so than the older, more established, when it gets a little bit bitter and stuff. And we've had when my neighbor had a landowner complain, you know, about it, and I've seen it. You know, I hunt and farm and everything. That geese do like the younger wheat. They're actually eating it up more behind our bean crop than the well-established and taller in the corn crop. You know, on the cover.
Yeah, yeah, and I think that's a great point. Definitely in Maryland, the geese and the deer are eating a lot of our cover crops and our crops. And definitely, I mean, you're right, some of that would get, I don't know of any studies that are actually quantifying how much nitrogen out of all of the nitrogen out there, how much they're taking up and is going back into the bodies of water through their waste. And then we have to remember that only about half of the nitrogen is in that above ground tissue. Half of it is safe underground in the roots. And so we're still at least getting that half that's underground that they don't have access to. And then your other point with the hunters liking the winter cereals, I would say that like our work has shown that even a little bit of the radish or of a legume in the mix can still have really important effects on lowering that carbon to nitrogen ratio and making the cover crop residue decompose better and more available. So if you are looking to recycle the nitrogen for the following crop and kind of trying to prevent some of that nitrogen tie up from the monoculture rye or wheat, just adding a little bit of a legume can still be pretty effective.
Thank you. And like I say, I think it would be hard to quantify the, the amount of that the geese are putting back overboard and stuff, but it's just something you can see anecdotally. And
Yeah.
I'm sure, it has an effect, but like I say, all in all, the cover crop program, it's been, I think, a wonderful, situation that we've had over the years here. Thank you.
Yeah.
All right, any other questions or comments?
Sure, I have one.
Go ahead.
So Sarah, you can get rye to establish and grow, even planted really late. You can get clovers to establish in the middle of the winter, but according to what you showed, are they going to do anything to scavenge any amounts of nitrogen from the soil, or is it too late at that point?
So I won't say they won't do anything because, of course, we're always going to have that continual new pools of nitrogen being added to the system. So we will have nitrogen being added over the winter from decomposition and nitrogen added in the spring. But they're not going to do nearly as much. They're not going to, any big pool of nitrate that's left in the fall, that pool is going to be lost. And so they're going to be much more effective at that purpose of scavenging that leftover nitrogen. The earlier they are planted to a certain extent. Like if you get them planted by early September, they're going to do a good job at that function. There's other reasons. So I definitely am not saying if you don't get your cover crop planted early, don't bother, because cover crops have a whole host of functions. And it is great to leave them if you don't get them planted early, try to let them grow longer in the spring, and they will still be very functional and adding a lot of biomass and residue and organic matter into that system, preventing runoff, preventing erosion, which is going to hold nitrogen in the system. So there's a lot of other functions that they can have planted at any time. But just if you are looking to scavenge leftover nitrogen that's left from your cash crop, it's best to plant them early.
Any other questions or comments?
Good job.
Thank you.
All right, I'll just remind you that next week, same time, same place, our next topic is evaluating forage soybeans as a diversion crop for deer, and that is being presented by our wildlife specialist, Dr. Luke McCauley. So I know that one's very pertinent here on the Eastern Shore for most of us. And I will send these records over to MDA for those of you who need your Maryland Nutrient Voucher or your Maryland Nutrient Management credits. I will send those over in the next day or so. All right, well, it looks like I don't see any other questions. Sarah got some great feedback in the chat box.
Okay.
So with that, hopefully we will see you all next week with our deer talk. Okay, I will send remind out any suggestions on when you would like to get the reminder.